Welcome to the Parsha Pairings with Jeff and Sherry. I'm Jeff Friedlander.
And I'm Sherry.
And we're glad you joined us. This week's Parsha is called Mishpatim, which means judgments. It comes from Exodus chapter 21, verse 1 through chapter 24, verse 18. Our Haftorah reading this week is 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 21 through chapter 12, verse 17. And our Brit Chadashah, or New Testament reading, is Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 through 42, chapter 17, verses 1 through 11, and chapter 22, and verses 22 through 27. This week's Parsha is going to pick up right where the 10 statements from last week left off. And if you're interested in that commentary, you can go back to last time. It's called the 10 Statements or the 10 Words. It comes out of Parsha Yitro, and we did a full teaching on what those really meant.
Right.
This Parsha is going to actually start to build on what we talked about, the categories of those 10 statements. And it's going to start to kind of, I guess the best way to describe it is add meat to the bone. It's going to take the skeleton and say, okay, now let's chew on that and see what the big picture is here, right? So after the review of those statements, B'nai Yisrael is what? They're terrified. They're just scared, frankly. And they don't want to hear them more because they've already agreed on what to do. And so Adonai is now going to address Moses, and he's going to read these words of this Parsha to him, and then Moses is going to read them out to all the people. And we'll see the depth of Adonai's concern for justice. And for, if you just want to, we're going to go through some details on these, but we're just going to touch the surface of some of those. Because
there's a lot.
There's so many. In fact, this is 11.5% in this chapter's. 11.5% of all of the mitzvot or the commands of the Torah. So all the commands of the Torah, 11.5% of them are right here. It's over 50 commands right here in this
so we are not going to address them all.
In 20 or 30 minutes, we're not going to hit that. We're going to do a very surface level. We're going to give you some depth on a few things, but take this as we go into it.
Right.
The overall theme of these chapters and these 50-plus commands is justice and righteousness for all people. That's the goal. All right, let's get into chapter 21.
One thing we want to make note of is that something that does get lost in when we watch movies is that this is actually the 5th time Moses has gone up the mountain.
That's right. He goes up 8 total times in Exodus.
And this is the 5th time he's gone up. And just as a kind of a review of what we mentioned in the 10 Words Parsha review was that this is not, the 10 Commandments haven't come down. The stone tablets have not come down yet.
Right.
They've just heard the words audibly, and then the people said, like you said, we're afraid we can't do this. So now Moses has gone back up, and now he's getting this additional information, which why I think that's important is what we talked about in the 10 words. We have narrowed down the 10 Commandments to those when the stone tablets come at the end of this Parsha. Yeah. But we haven't even got the stone tablets yet.
That's right.
So I think just putting all that in context helps us to understand what we're actually reading here. Yeah. So we open with a nice big topic. God goes right into it, which I think is important that he does this because this is a group of people. Remember, we're only 3 months out of Egypt. Yeah. And they've come out of slavery, and this is what this Parsha opens with, is slavery.
Yeah, it deals with slavery, which would make perfect sense for a bunch of slaves.
Right, and because these are the ordinances which you have set before them, and then he goes on to talk about slavery. Now, what is interesting about this is this has caused a lot of problems. Yeah. A lot of problems, because throughout the generations, many have gone back to this and said, well, God didn't abolish slavery, therefore we have all the rights that we want to do slavery. And we had the horrific African slave trade that we experienced in our modern world. We have sex trafficking today. So many sex trafficked kids.
And labor.
And
slavery
labor
today.
slavery.
In fact, it's estimated today, Sherry, there are over between 40, depending on which organization you look to, and it's hard to nail these stats down because obviously it's slavery, so it's hard, but they estimate between 40 and 50 million slaves in the world today. So this is a major issue today.
It is a big issue today. And what we need to understand is that God is not condoning that type of slavery.
No.
He is not at all saying that that's okay. As a matter of fact, in verse 16 of chapter 21, he says, anyone who steals a person and sells him or is found with him under his hand must be put to death. So what is he talking about then? We have to ask, what is slavery that he's talking about? Most of the Torah commands that we read about are going to be revolving around indentured servants.
Yeah.
Now, this is a very unique form of servanthood, slavery, if you will. And this type of slavery is actually a protection for someone, because what happens, the indentured slave, it applies to those who are paupers, debtors, or thieves. Yeah. And it's a way for them, if they are too poor to provide for themselves, they can indenture themselves to someone. Yeah. To work for food, work for a place to stay. They can, it's a place for if you had poor, which we read about this in this parsha, if you're a poor family, you can actually take your children and put them into indentured servanthood to provide for the family and for that child, that child has a place of safety. Yeah. So this is not about forced labor.
Yeah, this isn't about capturing somebody and making them do what you don't want them to do with the back of a whip.
Right.
And God was not for that. The Scripture doesn't bear out that was the attitude. And the only way a person scripturally, when we hear the term slave, we could put that word servant in there. But it was really the forcing came because of the person's choices. Many times they were poor, or they had been poor managers. Right. So they had money, or they put themselves in a position where they had borrowed and borrowed and borrowed and no longer could repay, and now they were forced to repay with their own labor, their own freedom. Right. They would give up their freedom to pay their debts. And very interestingly, this whole concept of slavery at the time, as Sherry said, not only is it a protection in many ways, but it also, we still see it today. If you think about your credit card balance, you go and borrow a bunch of money on a credit card and then you can't pay it. Well, two things have happened. One, you've become a slave to that credit card. You're now working to get money. You're trading your time and labor. And instead of getting to keep that money and spend it on what you may want to spend it on, you're required to spend it on what you already borrowed. Secondly, not only are you a slave to that lender, but if you can't pay it, there is a consequence. They can come and take things from you. They can mess your credit up. They can force you into a situation of not being able to have freedoms. So this concept of biblical slavery based on economic difficulties, that's been the practice for thousands of years, and we do it today in our modern America as well. So it's not a new thing. But God is protective of people because He doesn't want the indentured servant to be penalized for life. If there's a way for them to find freedom, He provides a way.
Well, as a matter of fact, this parsha gives the ways in the very next verses here. We get into verse 2. It says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve how long? 6 years. Yeah. And in the 7th year, he's set free. So there is a time limit on how long he can even be indentured to you.
Unless he chooses to stay with you. Later
Which
on
the next verse, the next section talks about, but if he loves you and he wants to stay with the family, he can choose to do that. Yeah. So there's this protection for you. You can't just force this person into lifelong slavery to you.
And to be clear, Sherry and I vehemently oppose forced slavery. We don't want anybody to mistake, speaking of biblical slavery, as we're describing it in the Hebrew culture here, as God put it down, as a justification for trafficking, for forced labor, for the African slave trade of the past. Any of that is evil at the highest level, and we absolutely vehemently deny that that's a good thing. That is opposed to God, and we don't support that. I just don't want anybody to have any mistakes as we speak of slavery.
Correct.
We're not for that.
You also have to look at
to understand
what the word slave and servant is here.
What is the Hebrew word
in
for that?
The Hebrew word used here is abed, which actually does mean slave or servant, and actually it's the same word used to describe Moses when he says he is an ebed of God. Abram is called an ebed of God, the servant of the Lord. So this word is interchangeable. It's not. That's why I think understanding God absolutely does not condone forced slavery. But he does allow for this place of you to work off your debts.
Yeah.
He allows for you to have protection if you're too poor. So the scripture is very balanced in this.
Yeah.
And man is the one that's taken it the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Verses 7 through 11 is where we see this idea of a father being able to, quote unquote, sell his daughter into slavery. Well, is that okay then? Can we do that? No, this is all up under that indentured servanthood idea that this family either is too poor or not able to afford. He can't just sell her because he's done with her.
And the owner of this daughter, if you will, has to allow redemption back to the family. Can't keep forever. So the slavery thing, let's just put that one to bed for now. That you can study it more in detail, but it's not what we think of when we hear the word slave. You move into verses 12 through 14, you get into what's called the city of refuges.
Yeah.
A person who accidentally kills somebody. We have laws like this on our books: an accidental homicide, an accidental vehicular homicide. An accident happens, and they're guilty of manslaughter. They're guilty of killing somebody, but it was accidental. It wasn't an intentional murder. And so in that, the Bible established a city where these could go. Now, the one point that I want to make on this, and we'll move to the next ones because we do have 50 laws to cover. No, we're not covering all 50, but we do have a lot to cover. Is these cities of refuge. Very interestingly, Sherry, we find out in other passages that when a person was put in this place, it was a discipline or a punishment because they were separated out because they had taken life. But when the current high priest died, that person who had accidentally committed murder was released.
Right.
So the high priest was the key to freedom, even from the most grave of sins, taking of a life. And that should speak to all of us about our great high priest, Yeshua, how he is the high priest that removes the greatest of sins from us. Okay,
that's good.
So moving on into verse
15 and 17, we get into this idea of honoring your father and mother, which is comes up under that fifth statement that we read about in the 10 words, honor your mother and father. And he talks about anyone who strikes his father and mother must surely be put to death, and whoever curses his father and mother must be put to death.
So that's a high value there. That's a big deal.
For honoring your father and mother to be in the top 10 statements.
Yeah.
Is a big deal.
And the penalty can be death. Now you say, one of the arguments people do say, they say, well, hey, are you killing somebody for talking back, being sarcastic? Right. That was not the intent of the command. The intent of the command is to truly understand the authority structures, not, hey, somebody was sarcastic. In fact, as you get into Leviticus, we'll study later, there were a lot of rules around who could be stoned and what they had to go through. There was a full justice system. Don't pull things out of context.
Right. So we're going to move to verses 22 and 25, and these are what got termed much later on the Latin word lex taliones, the laws of retaliation. Yeah. And this gets into this, if men fight and hit a pregnant woman so that her child is born early, yet no harm follows, the one who hit her, he is to be strictly fined according to what the woman's husband demands of him. He must pay as the judge determines. But if any harm does follow, then you are to penalize life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, blow for blow.
That's like a song.
Yeah. So we've got this. This has caused also some trouble for us, and Yeshua speaks to it.
Yeah, Yeshua speaks to this in Matthew, and he talks about, you've heard it said, have an eye for an eye, and he goes on to say, but, you have to understand that in the eye for eye context, that was dealing with a justice system. Yeshua speaks to it, and he says, well, you've heard it said eye for eye, but I tell you, if somebody slaps you on one side of the face, go ahead and give them the other side. If somebody walks up to you and says, hey, carry my bag a mile, go ahead and carry it 2 miles. If somebody does something to you, you don't like it, hey, just love on them, pray for them, pray for your enemies. So there's this whole idea here that Yeshua is not dealing with a counter to the justice system, because this one says the person who hits someone that leads into this eye for eye, they're going before a judge. Specifically, it says he must pay as the judge determines. Right. This is about a legal matter. I went to the judge. I did a crime. I went to a judge. Now, how should the judge judge my crime? eye for eye, tooth for tooth. In other words, make the punishment equal to the quality of the crime. In other words, if I only did a small crime on somebody, I get a smaller punishment. A big crime, I get a bigger punishment. And Yeshua's not countering that. He's talking about the heart of saying, you've heard eye for eye, meaning that if somebody just says something mean to you, punch them in the face.
Right.
I'm telling you, give them the other side of your cheek. Don't go crazy with them. If you get into the legal system, that's where this command comes into place, and that's a different story.
And I think the principle is what's important, because eye for eye, well, that couldn't possibly work. If I gouge your eye out by accident, how could you gouge my eye out in the same exact way? Or if I burn you by accident, how could you burn me in the exact same way? This is principle, and I think what you said is what we need to take out of this. The punishment has to match the crime.
Right. That's
you can't have
equal justice for all,
Correct.
as we still believe today. We don't always get it, but this is what God was setting up. Hey, this Torah is pretty smart, everybody.
Yeah.
It's really good. All right.
Then we're going to move into chapter 22, and this begins, and the end of 21, and this beginning of 22 really begins to define this very interesting way of dealing in our justice system with what's called restitution.
Yeah, he starts with animals at the end of 21, and then he moves into people in 22, and so we kind of see this
So
picture.
let's start in verse 1. Now, something to note also, in some versions of the Bible, this verse 1 is actually tucked up into the end of verse 21, so chapter 21, so check your readings, because sometimes, you know, the chapters were added later. So, but our verse 1, if a thief is found breaking in, is struck so that he dies, there is no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen, there is blood guilt, and he is to make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he must be sold for his theft, which is indentured servant.
Right.
If the item is found in his hand alive, whether ox, donkey, or sheep, he is to pay double. Now, it's interesting what we see here, that he makes this distinction that if a thief is found breaking in and he's struck so that he's died, there's no guilt for that. But if the sun's risen, then there can be. And here's what's...
So you got to ask the question.
Why does that matter?
Okay, so at 2 o'clock in the morning, the thief breaks in and I kill him, I'm fine.
But 2 in the afternoon...
But 2 in the afternoon, the thief breaks in and I kill him and I'm not fine? What is that about?
So you're looking at, in this context, the family would be at home. They're sleeping, and so if someone comes onto that property or breaks into a home, he's coming for ill intent.
Yeah, it's
with
not a
the
good
family
thing.
there. He's not coming to bring bread and break wine, right? Break bread with him. So if he is shot in that or killed in that, then the family is not at fault. But if in the daylight, there's going to be another story told, because you've got to find what is justice. Was this thief coming unannounced? Was he coming with ill intent? Because you've got broad daylight.
You're going to have a lot more questions, in other words.
And also, the family probably would be out in the field, so there might not have been anybody there. So there's a lot of questions. So it's interesting the Torah makes that distinction, because there's even a preservation for the life of a thief.
Yeah, that's right.
To say, you can't just shoot somebody that walks on your property in broad daylight because you assume guilt.
Yeah, and we have those same laws on our books today. Again, the Torah is very smart. And then he closes out here with paying double. The next verse talks about a man causing a field or a vineyard to be eaten by letting his animal out there. So in other words, you got a goat, you let your goat out of your gate because you didn't take care of your fence right, and it eats the other guy's field up. He says, hey, you got to make restitution on that. And so you have to pay extra money to fill it up. And the idea, go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
So the idea here is that when you have harmed your neighbor or your friend or your animal has harmed that, then you don't just fix it, you fix it better than it was.
Right. And it even says you have to give the best of your own vineyard.
Yeah.
You don't get to give the outskirts or the bad crops. You give the best. And this idea of restitution is something that we have loosely in our system. You hear the term, he's paying the debt to society.
Yeah.
We don't do it well today. Our prison system is not doing what it's designed to do. But this principle of I stole something from you and I get caught, I have to give you that back plus some.
Yeah.
And these next several verses, we see different variations of what that looks like.
Like verse 6 says, if a man entrusts his neighbor with money or items for safekeeping and it's stolen out of the man's house, when the thief is found, he must pay double. If the thief
Right.
is not found, then the master of the house is to present himself to God to see whether he has laid down on his neighbor's goods for any transgression, ox, donkey, etc. And then it says the one whom God convicts is to pay double to his neighbor. So here's this issue of, you hand your money over to somebody to manage it, to steward it, to take care of it. And if that money is lost, then there's a question. Why was it lost? Was the person you handed it to responsible? Or was there a thief in the house that took that money out and that person's not responsible? Whoever's responsible has to pay it back and even pay double. And we see this in our court system.
We do.
Right? Somebody goes in, it's a civil case. Hey, you harmed me. You're now fined X number of dollars, which was more than the dollars that I lost. So the Bible God was putting the same system in place that we actually use today. It's just giving it in different language.
And
because we usually don't have oxes involved. So.
Well, we also learned this in our civics classes in
Yeah.
8th grade that our justice system is based on the Word of God.
Yeah, and here it is.
Here's one of these examples where you
Yeah.
see this. So these next several verses, just really go through what the different scenarios
Picking
are
different
of
ones.
restitution, and we've talked about this before. How would it look if we raised our children under a restitution understanding?
Have you thought about that?
Hey, you stole my blocks and messed up my tower. Okay, well then, why don't you give him back those blocks and something out of your... If we began to teach our kids at a level of, there's not a punishment of, you're going to go to jail and, that, but a restitution. I think it would help us to live in a society that's a little more balanced and full of justice.
All right, then we move into verse 15. And it says, if a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. If her father refuses to give her to him, he must weigh out silver equal to the dowry for virgins. Mm-hmm. Sherry, how do you feel about this one, huh?
Well, I love this because, you have a lot of people say, okay, so we read about all this polygamy that's going on in the Bible. So what is this premarital sex idea coming from?
Yeah.
Where is adultery? How can you justify that? This verse speaks to this. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged, so she's not under a marital status.
Right.
He has violated her in some way. Then she still has to receive a dowry.
And by the way, the word seduce there is seduce or deceive or possibly convince, not even deception. It is not the same word that's used for rape.
Right.
So we need to make a distinction. This isn't a virgin that was taken against her will.
Right.
This would be consensual, but it is based on the idea that the man convinced her.
And this is outside of the boundaries of marriage.
So it's outside of marriage that's the key to understanding this verse here. Make sure you don't mix this with the idea of a rape. Right. That's a whole different world there.
Well, and what happens here is when a woman has been violated in that way, whether it's through rape or this seduction, if he chooses to walk away, she is now left with nothing.
And in this culture, she's disgraced.
She's disgraced, and she has no way to take care of herself.
Right.
So he's required to pay, to go to the father and to redeem that and to pay the dowry. But if not, if he doesn't want to marry her, he still has to pay the dowry for her.
Yeah.
Because now she's unable to get that. So this one verse has got so much complexity to it in the teaching us that there is a place for sexual relations, and it's within the boundaries of marriage.
So here we have purity and sexuality. Here we have father protection, family protection. Here we have males that have to guard the way they deal with their own lust and their own issues. Mm-hmm. And they are required to be responsible if they're going to go and, quote unquote, as we do today, sleep around.
Right. Hook up.
They have to be responsible for that. They just can't go live like that because there's a financial penalty for that. Yeah. And so this verse really, boy, if we applied this to today's culture, we would see our whole family structure come back. Okay, well, it's like 80 more of these to cover. We got to move forward. All right, so the next part.
17, 18, and 19, these are polytheistic practices that merit the death penalty. So you've got sorcery. If you're operating in sorcery, bestiality, verse 18, and then verse 19, idol worship again.
So all three of those are, hey, you're going to die for those. Those are major players. So don't be a sorcerer. Don't do bestiality. And certainly Stay away from idols. And you'll see throughout the entire Torah, idol worship comes up again and again and again because it is the major.
As does this next verse, verse 20. You must not exploit or oppress an outsider. You were outsiders in the land of Egypt. God hammers this over and over and over.
Yeah, it's so cool because God connects Israel to Israel. In other words, he says, look, Israel, I want you to treat people as you wish you had been treated.
Right.
You were an outsider. You were a foreigner in that land. Mitzrayim, right? In that Egypt. So you were a foreigner in Egypt. And look how you were treated.
Yeah.
You didn't like that. You didn't want that. That you cried out to me because of that. So when there are foreigners among you, you make sure you don't treat them that way.
And can't we do that today? Those of us that have walked a walk with the Lord for a long time and had so much healing, so much time with God, not to point our fingers at those who maybe have not, maybe who struggle with sins that we've overcome. Don't we sometimes become very judgy and treat those people differently and forget? I once was a sinner, I'm still a sinner, but I once was trapped in my sin, and God set me free.
Yes.
And not to look back at those who might still be trapped and go, who are you? Look at what I have. And
it's such a beautiful...
It's a heart of compassion.
Yeah, that's right.
It's exactly what God has for us.
Such a beautiful heart of compassion of God. He's given it to them. And I would say this too, just don't believe all the hype and the propaganda out there, because the modern nation of Israel is very compassionate. They export medical technologies all around the world free of charge. They send water well technology to places in Africa where there is drought, and they actually pay for it to go and dig wells that are 200 to 300 feet deep into African dry desert soil just to help feed villages, run by solar energy through technologies they created, pharmaceuticals, internet type products, and all of that. So Israel has been very compassionate to the foreigners, if you will. And we need to remember that. Okay, moving forward.
So we're in chapter 22 still. These next few verses, we read about how there's this law to protect the most vulnerable of our society.
Beautiful. We
have laws right here around how to protect the widows and the orphans and the poor among you, that you're not to just, take a poor man's cloak as collateral for something. You have to give it back to him at night so he can be protected. Or you can't just, mistreat widows and orphans. Because if you mistreat them in any way, and they cry out to God, it says, He will surely hear their cry, and His wrath will burn hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Boy,
oh boy, God is serious.
God is serious.
You take advantage of people that are helpless, that is serious business. You look at people that are hurting and they're suffering and they're widows and they're orphans and they're poor and they've got disabilities and they've got other things going on, and you decide to take advantage of that, or worse yet, just totally cast them aside, and they cry out, God's hearing that cry.
And so you're seeing this system shape up, that God is touching every area of society in this parsha.
And then he goes to authority here. He says, do not despise, and this is a little g God. It should be in your translation. If you're reading English translations, it should be a little g there. Some translations have it as a capital G, but it really shouldn't be. It's the word Elohim. And it says, do not despise God or curse a ruler of your people. And so this word Elohim, Sherry, actually means God or gods, or...
That word Elohim, actually, if we're going to translate it, because it's not gods like ones we would worship.
Right.
This is a judge. Those that have been set into authority over you, that have been placed as God has given the authority to them to dispense judgments. We're not to despise them.
Yeah, so this is the setup for authority structures. That, when God has given you an authority structure, you've got to obey and follow that, okay?
Yes. And then we get into the firstborn regulations, not to hold back the fullness of the crops of your vintage. You are to present the firstborn of your sons to me and your cattle, which gets back into what happened in Egypt. That whole idea of the firstborn, the redemption of the firstborn, which we have other teachings on that you can hear and see. But God is just reiterating this. Nothing that God has done so far, nor that He will do, is just random.
Right. And then He tells them to be holy, a holy people, set apart, which means kadosh, set apart. Then he talks about the animals. He moves in and he says, we're not to eat any animals that
the flesh has been torn.
That the flesh has been torn. In other words, roadkill. Don't eat roadkill, right? And why is that? And I love what Sherry and I were talking about earlier. She said, because we're not animals. We don't just get down like a lion and start chewing up whatever's laying around on the ground. That's not what we do. We are above the animals, so we eat above the animals.
Right.
Then we move into chapter 23, and it says, do not spread a false report. Don't join hands with the wicked by becoming a malicious witness. Don't follow the crowd. This is basically don't join the herd, right?
Yeah, that herd mentality.
Yeah, don't join the herd. And we can put this easily to us today. Hey, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all these things, right? Quit joining the gossip trains. Quit joining, spreading all the stuff that really doesn't matter and that doesn't build up or encourage. Spread the love, spread compassion, and spread the truth. Don't get in the game of all that stuff, okay?
Well, this actually also is a further definition of Statement 9 is, of do not lie.
Yeah.
This is a further explanation of what he meant by that.
Puts it up under the category. And then we get to treating, how do you treat your enemy? Verse 4 of this chapter, if you find your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of the one that hates you lying down under its burden, don't leave it, release it to him. Now this is, to me, this kind of is full circle for where we started, right? Because Yeshua turns around and he says, hey, we mentioned this a few minutes ago, the eye for an eye thing, right? He says, hey, if your neighbor hits you on the face, turn to the other side. Here it is.
Yeah.
So the eye for an eye can clearly be seen right here, because here's God saying, look, that guy's your enemy. He opposes you, but his donkey got lost. Don't just take his donkey because he's your enemy. Go give it back to him. Help him out.
And what did Yeshua say? Pray for your enemies.
Pray for your enemies, right?
Right.
I mean, this is exactly what we believe the New Testament is teaching, and it's all right here in the Torah. Yeshua explains to us many things that people have missed from Torah, and he helps us to see it fully, and this is one of those.
Then we have another reminder about don't oppress the outsiders, for you know the heart of an outsider, since you were an outsider in the
there
land
it is
of
again,
Egypt.
Same thing, right?
Then we get into the sabbatical years and the Sabbath, which falls under that statement 4, honor the Sabbath, which is more than just honoring that one day of seventh day. Now we get into another explanation of the land gets a rest.
Yes.
You can plant for 6 years, but in that seventh year, you're to rest the land.
Yeah.
So this rest principle applies more than just our 7 days a week.
Right.
And we get into what that looks like. And then he repeats again in verse 12, you are to do your work in 6 days, but on the seventh day you are to rest, and you're to let your animals rest.
Right. Don't even make them get out there digging the dirt.
Everything within your household is to rest.
Yeah, that's it.
Everything.
And then he moves on again with another repeat of idol worship. Verse 13, with all the things I've said to you, take heed, make no mention of the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard in your mouth. In other words, no more idols, man. Keep that stuff out of your mouth, your heart, your soul. And then verses 14 through 17, he gives us an introduction into these, what are called the harvest festivals. 3 times a year, the men of the country were to go to Jerusalem and at the temple for these 3 harvest festivals. We're going to talk about those quite a bit in the future. We're going to hit the book of Leviticus, and we're going to have a lot to discuss on those. But here is kind of the intro to that there's going to be a time when you're going to come together for these and offer them.
And then we have this just random little verse that has caused a lot of controversy over the years. And by the way, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
And when we say random, we mean random because he's just talked about all of these laws, and he gets the harvest festivals and goes, and don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. So we're gonna help you understand that one, but for today, we're gonna leave it very short. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. There are probably as many interpretations for people as there are people on this one, but let's table that. You can do some research on your own, and we're going to bring you some other information in the future so you can kind of get some pictures of that one. We want to close out this commentary today, though, with what really is a beautiful promise. So Sherry's just going to read this, and we're going to let you just hear it,
and receive
and we're not going to comment on it. We'll just let you receive it, and then we will say shalom to you.
And receive it just as a prayer over your own life.
Yes.
Behold, I am sending an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you into the place that I have prepared. Watch for him and listen to his voice. Do not rebel against him, because he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. But if you listen closely to his voice and do everything I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you to the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. You are not to bow down to their gods or serve them or do what they do. Rather, you are to utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You are to serve Adonai your God. He will bless your food and your water, and moreover I will take sickness away from your midst. None will miscarry nor be barren in your land, and I will fill up the number of your days. And we see in this that hearkening back to what did God say when they left Egypt? If you will obey me, I will not let the plagues of Egypt come on you. You'll have food, you'll have protection, you'll have health. Obey me. And then he gives this beautiful principle in verse 27 through 30. I will send my terror before you and throw all the peoples to whom you have come into panic and make all your enemies turn their backs to you. I will send the hornet before you, which will drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Hittites. I will not drive them out from before you in a single year. Otherwise the land would become desolate and the animals of the field will multiply against you. But little by little I will drive them out from before you until you are fruitful. Then you will possess the land. What a great principle for us today, that it is little by little that we possess the promises and the things of God. He doesn't just bring us into and wipe everything out,
Right.
because then we couldn't manage it.
Yeah.
It's little by little. He lets us get more fruitful in an area. He lets us have more freedom in an area. He moves us little by little. And that's a principle we all need to apply to our lives.
Amen.
Daily walk with God. Take up your cross daily and follow him.
Amen. And with that, until next time, we say God bless you and shalom.
Shalom.